Welcome to another edition of the Sonar Academy. I am Scott Heron, Director at Sonar. The aim of the Sonar Academy is to provide something useful and actionable to you relating to digital marketing. So this session is called Get More with Less, Transforming Your Marketing Function. If you have any questions, feel free to use the chat function. We'll try to use it as we go along. I'm really excited today because we're talking to a good friend of mine, Tim Dolan. I've known Tim for a really long time. I think it's probably about 20 years now. And Tim's been at the whole concept around modern marketing far before COVID and everything else. But well, actually, Tim, why don't I pass it over to you? Why don't you give us a little bit more of your background?
Sure. Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I think we were working together when we both had hair. And so just to kind of date ourselves a little bit. So yeah, no, I'm thrilled to be here too. This is going to be a lot of fun. My background, as you mentioned, has been focused on modernizing marketing organizations. And so my background's in digital marketing, particularly around strategic planning. And I started a consultancy about 5 years ago named Kickframe. And we focus on really building digital maturity within marketing organizations through a mix of training and consulting.
Very good. So in terms of context, setting up the session, obviously very crazy times right now. We're supposedly in Australia coming out of COVID, and there's some positive energy around that, but there's also the threat of the W and going back in. We're also hearing a lot about recession and that type of thing. So in the context of marketing and the marketing department, it's pretty stressful, and some decisions have been made, but people are trying to figure out definitely, a new way of working and that type of thing. So just starting there, what are some of the key trends and that type of thing with your clients?
Yeah, it is a crazy time. And I think in some ways it has affected different clients really differently. And so I'm thinking of one client who's the head of marketing for a food company that does a lot of canned goods. And it's impacted them in some ways really positively. In terms of consumer demand. They've already almost made their year. And then I'm looking at another client that does a lot of live events, and they've basically gone down to zero. So depending on, your industry, it's kind of hitting you in different ways. Specific to marketing, I think there's a couple of trends that I've seen just in having conversations with peers and some of the clients that I have. I think one is kind of just a heightened priority around digital channels. I think that's already kind of been there. But if you wanted some funding and momentum around online self-service, now's the time that those budgets are starting to open up as you're kind of serving customers differently. I think new ways of working, you mentioned that. I see that a lot. I think people are kind of reflecting on, not just remote work, but what are some of the different, ceremonies or principles of Agile, as an example, that they, want to potentially apply in terms of how they're working. And, like when it first happened, there was a lot of, I'd say, kind of doom and gloom about working remotely, but I'm talking to more and more people that have liked some elements of it in terms of the lack of, need to do, business travel, and some of the things that they thought would be really difficult to do. They found ways to do it really quickly in remote and agile methods. And I think the last thing that I personally find really inspiring is I have some clients that are just really stepping up and innovating. And I really love those stories of organizations that aren't just kind of waiting this out to kind of get back to what they were already doing, but like really pausing and taking a look at, what they offer and how they can offer it differently during this time, and, knock on wood, post-COVID. Like I do some work with some arts organizations, and, they've just been hammered in terms of their, seasons and live events being really shut down. But I'm thinking of one arts organization in particular. I mean, they're really doing an awesome job in terms of providing training and doing things like doing some kind of live events on a very small scale that's in a remote. And, I find it just really inspiring when they kind of take a look and say, maybe our product is live events. Our product is music, and we're finding new ways to be able to connect with audiences. And digital is a big part of that.
Well, digging into that, so I figure a lot of these industries have had to innovate based on necessity. I mean, if your main thing is a live event, you're not doing live events. You got to find something else. So it's great that they've found something underneath that's sort of a shared core theme or reason for being to leverage on. but that way of working and changing that way of working is so hard, especially
Yeah.
in organizations that have been doing the same things the same way for so long. So what are some sort of tips or tricks that you've seen about how to break the mold and do things differently?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think some people are being forced into working in new ways. And then I look at other organizations that, had agile principles as an example put in place. And they've been a lot more nimble and natural in terms of how they're kind of working right now that everybody's kind of at home and distributed. And so I think if as an actionable tip around ways of working, I think one thing that you can take a look at is some of the kind of well-known agile ceremonies that you may want to apply. So as an example, I think a lot of people are learning things now, right? And I talk to people about whether that's about the way they're working or changes that they're experiencing now that they want to carry forward. And one ceremony that is fundamental to kind of agile and Scrum is this idea of retrospectives. And I think like you can apply that idea of a retrospective during this time where you're kind of meeting with your teams and just kind of talking about what are we learning that we want to bring into post-COVID? What do we want to stop? What do we want to start? What do we want to continue? And not just kind of focus on getting out of here and forgetting some of these things that you're kind of learning along the way. And so I think that's one thing that you can start to apply.
I think that's a good one. And you could look at the retrospective in different ways. You could look at a retrospective in terms of, hey, we tried this new way of working and this worked about that and that didn't work that way. You could also look at retrospective in terms of, we talk about digital marketing and measurements, about what have we learned along the way. And then sometimes like learning what not to do is as valuable as learning what worked, that type of thing as well.
100% agree.
A key thing from one question for you. So you spend a lot of time working with organizations on training. And this for me is an area that most organizations do not do very well. Training ends up being the sort of ad hoc. There's a training budget. Someone goes off to a conference. They come back super pumped from the conference. And then 3 months later, it's gone. It didn't actually translate anything back to the organization. So what are some of your kind of tips relating to training or insights relating to training for marketing organizations?
Yeah, a real meaty area, and I think that's one that's not really talked about enough is training. And so I think some of the things that I've learned from my experience doing like designing and delivering training for marketing departments focused on digital marketing is we're at this kind of point where it's not about like people sort of understand the concepts of what digital marketing is. It's more of how do you apply it and increase digital maturity and sophistication and performance. So we're kind of at this next stage. And so before you go do any training, like one of the things that I do with my kind of clients or prospective clients is like, don't talk to me about topics. Don't talk to me about buzzwords. Let's talk about what you need to achieve and what maturity means to you. A lot of times we just say, we need to be more digital. We need to go digital. What does that actually mean in the context of your marketing department? In 18 months, what does your marketing need to look like to quote unquote be more digital? And I think that's a great alignment activity. It's something that oftentimes people haven't discussed, at least in those terms. And then as an instructional designer, what I can do is now I've got the bullseye in terms of how I can kind of work background and understand the kind of training that we can put in place to be able to get there. The other part of it is in doing so, you realize, what training can't do. There might be things that are more process related, more talent related, agency relationships. And so, training is one part of maturity, but there are other ones that we need to do. And without kind of a clear idea what the outcomes you're driving for, it can really be, as you're talking about, like an interesting day at a conference, which could be inspiring for 48 hours, but it's not actionable and lasting for marketing departments.
That's interesting. So clients approach you saying we need to be more digital, potentially motivated by things they're seeing in terms of customer behavior and everything else. But in being more digital, actually, it could not be training. It could be like, actually, in order to kind of get some of these things going, you need more relationships with other departments or a different way of working and that type of thing as a core need.
Exactly. And I think when in unpacking that, Scott, a bit is that, that critical relationship between marketing and ID. And I
Mm.
think that's one that in a lot of places has really sort of matured and aligned over time. But it's such a critical enabler. Like I find myself playing that role for a lot of clients in consulting capacity, where you're almost translating the capabilities and the goals that the marketing team has, and aligning that to the roadmaps and the guidelines and the budgets that the technology team manages. And so, how do you start to do that? And so that's where training can help. I think one of the most successful training programs that I've been a part of was essentially co-written by the technology and marketing teams. And so it wasn't Tim Dolan from Kickframe, high on a mountain giving commandments around digital marketing. It really was tapping into a lot of subject matter experts that existed across the organization, giving them a platform to be able to talk about what their goals, priorities, capabilities are. And that provided like a really custom and actionable a training program for everybody to get on the same page. And I think like if you're on, thinking about digital training and want to kind of pursue that a little bit more, one is like the maturity piece. And then I think the other thing that you might want to do is just go broad before you go specific. Oftentimes you'll see something in the headlines around TikTok or machine learning, and you'll want to get a deep experience and training about that particular topic. But I found that there's a lot of benefit around just having a foundational understanding of the principles and the topics and the corporate priorities around digital marketing, and making sure that everybody's on the same page. Then you can get into some of the more sophisticated topics and kind of build on that over time.
I like that. So yeah, I definitely like the go broad before you go specific. I think it's such a natural thing for digital marketing to chase the latest thing, that the TikTok equivalent. Like there's just
Yeah,
always something out there. We need a TikTok strategy, that type of thing.
yeah,
So understanding the
yeah.
overall context of the overall marketing picture, and then
Hmm.
understanding how the different things fits in and level setting, I think is a really good point. But
Yeah,
one question. Go ahead,
absolutely.
Tim.
Go ahead.
Well, a question for relating to that is, well, I guess it's sort of like, where do you start? I like your level set point, but there's also this sort of like, there's always so much to do, and marketing is just so big, and changing a modern way of working and that type of thing is pretty big. Like,
Yeah.
where would you start in terms of that piece?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two parts to that. One is like your digital marketing maturity, your digital marketing strategy needs to align to like your business objectives and where you want to go as a company. And so that bigger kind of alignment piece, I think, is kind of obvious. And I think a lot of marketers, for the most part, kind of have that down.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other part, I was going to give like a tip to somebody that is a marketing leader right now that's thinking about their org and their competencies and their maturity path, is talk to some of your external partners and get their points of view in terms of where they see your strengths and weaknesses and opportunities. Like I think of you, Scott, like in your role, you're probably seeing, all of these different clients and all of these different organizations, and getting a sense of like where their priorities are and what does a modern marketing team look like. And that's hugely valuable perspective that a lot of kind of heads of marketing within a client-side organization don't have that exposure to. And so I think if I was like a VP of marketing, I think of like an obvious and easy place to start is just talking to some of my agencies and
Mm.
asking for some of their kind of honest, critical feedback around where they see the gaps, where they see the market moving, where they see some of the areas of training that we might want to focus in on.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. What about more like tool-based things? So in terms of like, do you see any opportunities for organizations to align around different tools that kind of help them along the path of modern marketing?
Yeah, I think like there's obviously like the software and the tech stack and the capability tools that you want to have integrated and shared to the largest degree, and that's where like this partnership with IT and Martech is so important. I think as it relates to kind of planning tools, I do think that's a big area of opportunity. And so I think about some of the organizations that um, are quite sophisticated in the area of digital marketing, and they have almost like a system in place to be able to take on different things like measurement as an example, or running experiments as an example. They're not done as kind of one-off ideas that somebody wants to be able to do. There's a kind of a structured way to be able to identify a hypothesis, design an experiment, put measures in place, have in-flight reporting, capture results in a way that other people that weren't exposed to the campaign or program could reference and benefit from. And so I think that's a big area of a big weakness, to be quite frank, in terms of a lot of the organizations that I deal with, is just maturity around measurement in particular. And to your point about like processes, I think having this sort of system in place is one way to be able to tackle it.
I think that's a dynamite point. I want to kind of dig into that a little bit more, because I think most people in marketing and digital marketing buy into the idea of hypothesis led and test and learn and that type of thing, but it doesn't happen. Somewhere along the chain, it falls down. So what are some real specific things that, marketers can do, or that you've seen in other organizations getting it right, to try to actually make that happen?
I think a couple things that are just really practical would be having senior level folks within the marketing department set objectives in terms of the number of experiments that need to be run per quarter. And it's one thing to be able to talk about being hypothesis led and letting data, drive your decision making, but just to get really real. And so like if a marketing team, is on the hook for 10 experiments per quarter, and that's up from 2 the previous quarter, like that's one way to be able to make sure that there's some accountability. And so I think that's one part. I think another part is kind of like a larger, almost cultural point around, you hear it a lot about giving people permission to fail. The reality is, if you're running a lot of tests, a lot of those tests are going to fail. And so the benefit of it is kind of breaking out what are some of your big bets versus what are some of the optimizations, making sure that there's a balance there, and making sure that people are, particularly senior managers, are supporting their teams even when some of the results are going bad. Because when the results are going bad in the context of a well-defined experiment, it's a lesson learned, and that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big part of it, is setting expectations and targets, and then supporting people throughout the process to make sure that they're not going to get penalized if some of the return on ad spend starts to dip, or sales start to go down. Like that's kind of the bet that you're making. The more experience you're going to do, the smarter you're going to be in the long run. You're going to be able to benefit from that.
I think that's a good point. I feel like culturally in most places, marketing has had to do their own internal marketing. So they do. They're responsible for always showing the home run. And public higher ups, like the CEO expects marketing to talk about the home run, but meanwhile, like there's just not going to be home runs. But the value of getting it wrong and the learning from the getting it wrong can probably be monetized just as much as the home run. But culturally, in most organizations, I think it's hard, and probably maybe a credibility piece. Like I know I've definitely worked at agencies, and agencies need to tell a good story quite often for all the money that's been spent as well. So the alignment of agencies to tell a good story, and the marketing team being complicit in trying to tell a good story too, it's hard to figure out. Like it's hard to have the trust to basically say, like, we tried this, it didn't work.
Totally. And that's where, like, I that's a great point about where agencies come in. I think you kind of have to be hand in hand and lockstep in this stuff, right? Because you'd hate to be, want to be uncomfortable if you're that account director reporting back on 10 tests that ran, and 8 proved out didn't meet the hypothesis that you had. And all of a sudden feeling really uncomfortable about reporting that back. And it's like, no, look, this is the point. The point is to run these, learn from the results, take the implications, and get better over time. And so I think I look at like companies like Airbnb with their like data university, and some of these initiatives that are being put in place to be able to quote unquote democratize data within organizations. And I think those kinds of companies are really going to benefit, where they don't have to like, lean necessarily on a really thin data science team. They have the capability to be able to kind of run tests and see results and interpret those things because they've got the tool set and the skill set and the mindset around learning.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the clients where I've seen that democratization of data work the best was a financial services company where we're talking like everybody rallying around an Excel sheet, but at least it was a
Yeah,
shared Excel sheet and
yeah,
everybody, and it
totally.
all plugged up to the same thing. So it wasn't big data and AI and all that kind of stuff. It was an Excel sheet. It was, relatively big organization, but definitely the point wasn't to be that flashy with the data, but the
Yeah,
KPIs were lined up to the overall objectives of the company. It was a shared Excel sheet, and also really importantly, shared definitions around some of the things, which goes
yeah,
back to your
great
point
point.
of alignment between IT and marketing, just being able to talk the same talk.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, I think that alignment was really helpful in terms of just mobilizing marketing initiatives between departments and everything else, because they're all pointed towards that same cell C3 target across the
yeah.
organization. Yeah.
Yeah. Spoken like someone that knows their way around an Excel sheet.
Pivot tables,
Yeah,
love a pivot table.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's awesome.
All
Yeah, I
right.
think one of the things too, just because I know we want to talk about like practical tips and things
Yeah.
is I do a lot of training and consulting work around briefs and the briefing process.
Mm.
And so, this is one of these areas that marketing departments and agencies kind of do some, you know, I don't want to call it navel gazing, but reflection around, what's kind of working, what could be optimized around how we kind of start projects at the beginning. And I think I run a webinar or a course called Modernizing Marketing Briefs, and we take a look at, in some ways, like briefs are these like static objects in an increasingly like really dynamic world. And so how does like a brief that, to your point, in this presentation culture of marketing that feels like fixed in the final answer, what if we learn something once it gets into market? Like, does
Mm.
the brief still have the same kind of role? And I think there's some opportunities to be able to incorporate kind of testing and learning within a more modern brief and briefing process. And so that means like identifying some of these hypothesis and reporting things up front within the context of the brief,
Mm-hmm.
having things like a lesson learned repository that you can kind of use when you're kind of filling out insights and setting targets, and like using that as a real important resource when you're creating briefs. And then when stuff gets done or stuff that's in flight, you're kind of documenting those lessons, to our earlier point, within a retrospective for other people to be able to benefit. I've got a link I'll send to you after this with a couple of different like tools
Mm.
that marketers can use about like structuring tests, organizing their findings, and restructuring their marketing briefs.
I mean, that's great. Yeah, because like the
Yeah,
traditional briefing document just kind of isn't fit for purpose for the kind of new world of marketing.
totally.
But I know also from talking to you in the past that the briefing process is something that you also look at. Can you talk a
Yeah,
little more around that?
yeah. I'm a huge believer in like, as someone who was a planner in their career and written their fair share of briefs, I think like the biggest impact in some ways is the briefing. And not to say that you can't do your homework on a brief, or change the boxes on the form, but I think so much can be changed in terms of getting to better, particularly like digital marketing outcomes in the briefing process. So what does that mean? I think like one is changing up the composition of the team that you're briefing. And so that's like bringing your technology and digital folks, UX, data science, upstream into the briefing process.
Mm.
I think the other part is, capabilities are maturing so fast. You need to be able to have some of those subject matter experts consulted early. And so, like in, agencies often, are really reluctant to kind of put recommendations. They want the briefs to be about the idea and not the execution. But I think those
Mm.
things are kind of coming really, really close together. So I think you have to kind of bring up some of the expertise about some of the capabilities that agencies or the marketing team might not be aware of. Like, did you know that you can segment this database or serve a message to this kind of user in a post logged in state, as an
Mm.
example? Like, these are things that the channel owner would know that would really be really, really helpful upstream in a briefing environment for marketing teams to be able to explore.
I mean, that's great. That's really good. Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes left. If anybody has any specific questions, let us know. But in the meantime, I'm going to just summarize some of the key things. And Tim, you're going to have to help me out because I can't really read my own writing. So let's see how we go on this one. So one thing I've got is go retro. So I figured that would mean sort of like the retroactive. And that could be process. What did we learn from the process? That could be what did we learn from the actual project, in positive or negative. From a process perspective, I've got start small. Try to on a single stream of work. Also get that senior level support for that kind of test and learn, hypothesis driven type of thing. Get senior level support. And from the briefing tool perspective, the briefing tool, and so kind of modifying that with more hypothesis and testing, that type of thing. Then also briefing process in terms of getting more people involved, talking to agencies or other partners and that type of thing up front as well. And then also the theme of bridging the gap between different departments, specifically between marketing and IT, and having a level set language to talk from and that type of thing as well. I'm sure I missed a few things in there. Did I?
I don't know. That sounded pretty meaty to me. I think we've covered a lot of ground, Scott.
Very, very good. All right. Well, awesome. Do you have anything else to share? Any kind of thoughts that we haven't kind of touched on already?
I think it's a really interesting time. Like it's been interesting, like talking through this with you, Scott. Like in terms of, what have we learned throughout this process, and what can we apply going forward? I think there's going to be some real companies and individuals and new brands coming out of this COVID period that have taken stock, have gotten to know their customers a little bit better, have gotten to know like their teams a little bit better. And I'm really interested in seeing some of those folks really kind of jump out of the gates when we start to quote unquote kind of return back to some kind of normal. I think this is a really interesting time that I think a lot of smart people are spending the time wisely and are going to benefit from. So I love the fact that you're doing these webinars, because I think that's in service to what I think a lot of us are trying to do, is just use this time really productively.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's it's fun to do the share. And I agree. I think one of the key things is maybe one of the challenges will be for companies have had to change. They've had to make change their way they do things, change their products, change all these different things. How do they bottle that and bring that into things when hopefully COVID isn't around? And somehow but still keep that culture of innovation and that spirit of change, while also having less stress and anxiety, hopefully, in their lives as well, will be really interesting. But that's, I mean, even pre-COVID, one of the things I love about digital marketing is it's always changing. There's always something to everything else. And like you said, it's not about TikTok. It's about the way of working and embracing the change and adaptability and that type of thing.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And the other thing I'd say is I've done a couple of other kind of training. I do a lot of training. And I've done a few training webinars, and so if I explore a couple things within them around agile marketing, modernizing marketing briefs, and other things. So I'm happy to send you the link there. It's kind of free 1 hour webinars on training. If any of you want to check that stuff out,
that would be great.
Share.
I've definitely checked out some of those, and they're really good. Awesome. All right, so thanks a lot, Tim, and thanks for everybody who joined. And have a great day. Talk to you later.
Thanks, Scott.
You're doing.